Hi, can you hear me? Is that better? Oh, okay, good. I'm so glad to be here this afternoon, and I do want to recognize the Philadelphia Women's Support Group for being willing to do the groundwork to put this together. So are they here? Can you stand so let everybody see who you are? This is a very dynamic group of women that have a tremendous amount of information that I hope many of you other women would take 2 hours out of a weekday, Wednesday or Thursday or Tuesday, and come and see what they're about. And as I talk about some of the aspects of melanin today, I'll probably elucidate more into what it is that they're actually studying. I do just want to hold this book up, not just because I wrote it, but it kind of like it's going to set the tone. More and more technology is coming forth today on many, many levels. We just saw a situation this weekend with O.J. Simpson as to how just through the use of his cellular telephone that he was able to be picked up from satellite and located on the planet. And it's real important that we begin to understand what these technologies are, whether they're the use of laser, microwave, radio waves, TV waves, cosmic waves, ultraviolet light, etc., what this really is. And to my surprise and true thankfulness, I'm understanding that what I am seeing before my very eyes is an externalization, an external manifestation of my own innate gifts and talents. Yes, it's very important for you to begin to understand that melanin is the complete composite of all forms of light, known and unknown to us. Now, I just want you to think about that for a minute, because when you are actually looking into the blackness, the bleakness, whether that's into your face, whether that's into a dark room, whether that's actually looking up at the sky, you are actually looking at all forms of life. Really, for the best thing I can describe to you, you are really looking into the face of the Creator. Now, if we want to go back as far as Egyptian times, I think one of the most controversial pharaohs, excuse me, Akhenaten or Akhenaten, depends on how you pronounce that, was known as the Pharaoh of the Sun. And the interpretations by Lubowitz and other hieroglyphic or Egyptian historians really were not able to truly translate why this particular Pharaoh and his entire dynasty was quite focused on the sun and sun worshiping. It wasn't as though they were actually just worshiping an object that they happened to have chosen within their environment, but the understanding of recognizing that this was a greater emanation of oneself. That's what actualizing and honoring the sun was about, recognizing that not only does the sun shine in the daytime, but also at nighttime, because what you are seeing is a greater manifestation of more forms of light at night than in the day. Now, let's just look at that. I don't know how many of you had basic, how can I describe that, color identification in first, second, third grade, etc. They asked you to name 3 primary colors, and then you had to name their complementary colors, and they had you mix them together in paint, and you had to explain what you were seeing. How did you make yellow? How did you make blue? How did you get purple, brown, etc.? But the key here is that it's very important to understand that where there is no light or very little light reflects itself as being pale or white. And when there is intense color of a deep, deep intensity, it always manifests itself as being darkened or actually black. Now, what am I saying then when we're actually talking about this substance known as melanin? Let me just give you a little history here. There's so much information on this, and the more I review this, the more work I realize is available for me. I'm not going to bother us with a lot of this scientific data, because I want you to leave here today with a clear understanding of when you look at your face, when you're washing your skin, when you're happening to look down at a black shoe, and I happen to like black patent leather shoes a lot, and it's a real scientific reason why. There was a play that came out that patent leather shoes, black patent leather shoes always reflect up, and at the end of this lecture I hope you begin to understand why, because it's actually the front and back are double intensity of the full electromagnetic spectrum of light. Okay, so to your surprise, I think that you should begin to recognize that, again, on a written scientific basis, melanin began to be studied as early as 1658. It was interesting that this gentleman by the name of Lecher, a French gentleman, found it was very interesting to note that in certain animals, whether they're frogs or they were cockroaches, etc., that they had this substance known as what they call a basic pigment that allowed them to have particular colors. In 1737, there was a gentleman by the name of Albinus who recognized and was able to identify that this particular pigment had specific characteristics and was interested in finding out where it originated from. Now, it was interesting that his name, being spelled A-L-B-I-N-U-S, Albinus, had been coined also as the precursor to a particular disease where this pigment was not present, or albinism. Now, in the United States, one of the foremost gentlemen in pigmentation research, his name is known as John Mitchell, and he's located at Harvard University. And there is a whole center there at Harvard University and has been there for the last 40 years that does nothing but research on pigmentation and all of its aspects. Now, in 1826, there's a gentleman by the name of Linnet who was able to describe that this pigmentation was contained in a cellular structure known as a melanocyte, in little granular forms known as melanosomes, and that these tissues could undergo abnormal functioning to produce what now is known as melanoma, or cancer. In 1987, there was a journal that scientists have put together known as the Journal of Pigment Cell Research that has been in publication and that is produced every month on cells of pigment. How many of you are subscribers? How many of you have any idea that there is a medical journal that's put out every month on your pigment? Do you have any idea what's in it? Fine. It's interesting that out of all the cells studied in the body, the most important and the most common cell studied is the red blood cell. Next to that, or second, is the nerve cell or the neuron, and then thirdly is the melanocyte. Now, I think it's very interesting that at least on the news and in the newspaper, we are told about what blood cells do to some capacity and about different neurologic diseases, multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, etc. But now, I haven't heard in these general information centers that the third most intense studied cell is the melanocyte. Have you? But scientifically, though, when the money is looked at as to what parts of the body the most money and research is spent on, it's the red blood cell first, the nerve cell, and then it's melanin. Now, again, there's a gentleman by the name of Thomas B. Fitzpatrick, who's also at Harvard University, who has been doing this research on melanin for the last 40 years. And they have one of the largest libraries and one of the most extensive research centers on pigmentation and melanin there. Now, in my book, I talk about some basic things about what melanin does, what it does not do, its sensitivities, etc. And I think that I should just review that very quickly. I wanted to talk about some updated aspects of melanin because I want to tie this in specifically to, again, a lot of the technologies and sciences that we're looking at. But do understand that I want you to be stimulated to definitely begin to do further readings and studying on melanin. There's all kind of data available, but it's not in the most typical sources. But when you do run into the source, you will find hundreds of thousands of articles on all different types of melanin and what it does. I talked about in my book, for example, that because of this molecule and because of its relationship to us, it has to be addressed under all circumstances in every aspect of our life. This is not just something that colors our hair, colors our eyes, etc., but it actually is the foundation from which the cells of our bodies have originated. It's very interesting. They talk about something that happens within the first 3 days after conception, that something known as a neural crest forms. And this neural crest is responsible for producing our entire nervous system, the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves, and the brain. And whether this is completely formed properly or not depends on the presence of melanin. When melanin is not there or it is in abnormal amounts, then this is when we begin to have neurologic defects, retardation, and one of the most common problems with melanin deficiency is spina bifida. So cerebral dystrophy, cerebral palsy, all of these things happen to deal with the health and the amount of melanin that's present at the time of conception. All races on the planet have melanin, but its capacity to be produced, the type that's produced, and its capacity to interact with the external environment is a genetic decision. And so therefore, when you are looking at Caucasians, these individuals do have melanin, but they have a very interesting type. It's a very, very small structure, and they are clustered together kind of like little granules or cracker crumbs. So if you can get the idea that instead of having these nice round beach balls of a particular pigment in a cell, they're all clustered together in little crumbs in a particular corner of the cell. And so therefore, it appears, because they're all folded up, that you can't see this pigmentation. Now I wanted you to get this very clear of what's happening, because it's just like you having a sheet that's a beautiful pattern, but if the sheet is all folded up and you fold it up to the size of this book, you're not going to be able to appreciate that if you put it in the middle of the floor, as opposed to you taking the entire king-size sheet and folding it totally out flat and then putting it in the middle of the floor. It actually takes up the whole attention of the room. Well, this is the main difference that happens between different races and also with the different interactions that occurs with melanin. That is to say that because this substance is crumpled up, folded on top of itself, it has very little reactivity with the environment and has a very limited capacity to relay information to the nerves, to the brain, so that the cells of the body will know what to do because of the particular environment. For example, what am I saying? It's interesting that melanin, as I said, does not originate from skin cells. It originates directly from the brain. So if you happen to be looking at yourself and you recognize that you are jet black in the mirror, and you recognize that for every melanocyte that you have, and normally in Africans we have somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 melanosomes per square millimeter of skin, that you are actually looking at an external brain. So that means that if you are incredibly black, that when you look in the mirror, you are looking at an externalization of your brain. And I just want you to think about how awesome that is, because that means now that you have two brains. You have one that's outside that can see, feel, touch everything, plus you have one that's also in here, up at the top part of your body. Now, so you have to understand that if there's another individual standing next to you that has no pigmentation, which means that they have very little melanin, or that it's folded up on itself very tightly, like the sheet in the middle of the floor, then who should have the greatest sensory capacity on any level? Obviously the person who's standing out there with a brain outside of them and one that's also within them. Now that's awesome. Okay, now that's really important to understand. Now it's very interesting because they did some experiments with animals, for example, that based on the eye, because the eye has only two primary colors. The eye is either naturally dark brown or black, or it is blue, naturally. Any other shades of color of the eye are a reflection of toxins that have been deposited upon the iris. So any hazel eye is a toxic condition. So you either have blue eyes or you either are supposed to have dark brown eyes or black. The black dark brown eye is a natural sunglass because on the top of the nerve, from the back of the eye, it has been protected with melanin, so that the capacity to look into the sun, the capacity to be exposed to ultraviolet radiation, the capacity to be exposed to cosmic waves, radio waves, etc., have much less effect directly on the nerves from a damaging perspective as opposed to that eye that is denuded or doesn't have any pigment. So therefore, it is quite sensible and intelligent for individuals that have hazel eyes or blue eyes that they must have some type of external protection across the eye when it is exposed to intense light. Now, they found something very interesting, is that every particular part of the brain also has to be illuminated by light. If the brain isn't illuminated by light, then it actually stops functioning. So I think this is very interesting because what did they do? They took some children and they exposed them and raised them in totally white rooms. These individuals spoke only because of the individuals who would come in and stimulate them. They basically did not elicit very much brain function at all, being raised in a totally white environment. Now, if you were listening to what I was saying, I told you what, on an electromagnetic basis, the white light is. It is actually very little light. Because these individuals were not allowed to actually see blue, green, yellow, beige, purple, etc., there was very little stimulation to the brain to actually keep the electromagnetic circuitry working to stimulate the cells to communicate to one another, which is what produces intelligence. So that's why they have found that when we look at the psychology of colors, that when we use pastel colors or muted colors, they automatically allow the person to think less. So we call that relaxing, because there's very little light or stimulation related to the brain, and so therefore it allows us to basically not appear alert and have to be stimulated to think about making a decision about anything or absorbing it. So that's why in the doctor's offices now, who are really into making your visit painless and relaxing, they will have very pale grays, very pale lavenders, etc., to actually decrease the stimulation to your brain, because now they're actually cutting out full light spectrum so that you can actually go into a state really of what I call kind of intellectual retardation, because it's a form of actual malnourishment from the lack of light. There's a gentleman that has done a tremendous amount of research with light exposure and health. His name is John Ott, and he recognized that irregardless of what race you are, you have to be exposed to a certain amount of light to be able to stay healthy, to maintain a healthy immune system, and most of all, to actually remain intelligent. And this gentleman was a Caucasian, and I thought it was very interesting that he even joined with MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, doing studies with lower animals to prove that you could actually determine the reproductive capacity of an animal. You could determine the sex that the animal was able to reproduce. You could determine the intelligence. You could determine the health of an individual just by manipulating the light intensity and the colors that the animal was exposed to. So it was very interesting. They decided to do some research with chinchillas and minks, because there happened to be a farmer who was having some problems maintaining his mink and chinchillas because only females were being born into the litter. And so therefore there were no males being born, so he could not continue his litters. And so he didn't know whether it was in the feed or what the problem was. Well, John Ott went there and recognized that the frequency of the lights in the pens was adverse to stimulating the production of male species minks and chinchillas. Now, there's a book that has just come out by a gentleman by the name of Leahy, if I'm not mistaken. And the name of the book is Sex and the Brain. And what this gentleman has actually identified is that he's a pathologist, is that as he looked at the brains that were coming through his laboratory, he recognized that all brains are female. And research now is showing that if a developing fetus who is destined to be male is not exposed to testosterone in the uterus 2 to 3 weeks prior to birth, and then again 2 to 3 months after birth, that this individual will have problems having an affinity toward the opposite sex or complete male development. Now, I thought that was very interesting, and this person has really been bombarded on TV in relationship to dealing with the propensity for bisexual, heterosexual activity. We have a problem with that now, with many people having sexual identity issues. And with the advent of being exposed to more radiation, more laser rays, mothers are cooking food now with microwave ovens. We're being exposed to all kinds of unnatural lights and all different spectrums of lighting in our home, that it appears that this is probably going to be identified as one of the major problems that is happening to the mothers during the gestational period, that they are being either bombarded with abnormal frequencies of light, or that they are not actually receiving enough light, and this is actually a problem. We are already noticing that women who are working 8 to 10 hours a day and doing close eye work, that is, if they're reading a lot, automatically and naturally will produce female children almost 9 to 1 as opposed to male children. We're also noticing that women who are exposing themselves again to very high frequencies of radiation from computers, or that they're working with microwaves, etc., their children are born with a greater risk of mutations, hernias, a lot of other things. So I'm very concerned about this in the melanin-dominant community, and those individuals who have outright melanin must become aware of what does it mean when they are actually walking into a field of microwave. Many times we go places and there's a sign that says, you know, don't enter if you have a pacemaker, okay, because this is a high microwave field. What does that mean if you are actually jet black and you're in that field? Not that you have a pacemaker, but actually how does that affect the melanin molecule? If you are melanin recessive, how does that actually affect you? Because now we're finding out that these high frequencies of light, and when I say high frequencies of light, I'm talking about those frequencies of light that we normally cannot perceive or see unless it's reflected back to us through a machine. Okay, you have to understand what I'm saying. For example, most people do not know that they are being exposed to ultraviolet radiation unless it is being measured by a machine or it's being actually reflected back to you through some type of instrument. You don't know that you're in a field of radio waves unless you actually have a radio there that can actually reflect that back to you. Now, some of the interesting things that are happening that we're finding out about melanin when we look back at many of the hieroglyphs, many of the codices in Mexico, and many of the ancient writings in Africa, is that people were always able to communicate with each other mentally and be able to talk to each other verbally and be able to play musical instruments by drums and communicate hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Now, we are also noticing, and we also are aware of the fact that radio waves can be perceived by any individual that is sensitive to these waves that is melanin dominant. And this is one of the things that Frances Cress Welsing talks about when she talks about the Dogon people and their capacity to have used the stars in the sky as designs for their clothing, to paint the outside of their huts, etc., because they were walking X-ray films. Now, what does that mean? If any of you are astronomers, you know that there's getting ready to be an experience of an interesting phenomenon that hasn't happened for millions of years. That is, that there are bodies that are going to collide with Jupiter, okay, next month, starting the 16th or so, okay, that are going to have a profound effect on this planet. These meteorites, there's going to be a meteorite shower that will be hitting Jupiter that will be felt definitely upon Earth. Now, these meteorites and other star systems can be identified, and there's now all kind of thousands of volumes of star charts available in the planetariums because of radio wave X-rays. So what happens is that they have particular X-ray plates that are sensitive to radio waves that they expose through a telescope pointing in a direction where they suspect there is a star. The long wave radio waves bombard the plate because it is a form of light, expose it, and then they develop the plate and then calculate the amount of light there based on star years to determine how far the star is away, how big it is, etc. Now, as I said, melanin is the physical manifestation of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So that means that wherever you are, any light that is like you, your melanin is going to be able to pick that up and relay it to your brain, because every granule of melanin is directly sitting on a nerve ending, because it is a neuron. It's a form of brain tissue. So if you happen to be jet black and you're walking around outside and there's a particular star that's up in the sky, the amount of light that's being pulsated from this particular star will actually hit your melanin granules. Your nerves will then relay that to the brain, and it will make an image. So these individuals then knew that as they lived from month to month, year to year, that there would be certain patterns in the sky, and they just actually recorded them on paper, on straw, on their clothing. So then when the Europeans were able to find out where this tribe was, however they discovered them, and one individual happened to recognize that these were actually the same patterns of heavenly bodies that they had to create a radio telescope and special X-ray film to be able to know that these bodies were up there. These individuals are walking around with no clothing on and no shoes. How could they have the same star charts? And the reason is because the melanin functions the same way. Now, many of our ancestors, our immediate ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents, have talked about the visions that they've had, the voices that they've had, and even our little children are all the time talking to beings and entities. Now, they are actually hearing at a distance and also hearing in different dimensions. Now, these things were all known to us. But for whatever reason, and that we won't go into that this time because we're going to stay strictly on melanin, we have begun to ignore and to educate this awareness out of ourselves, which causes us to have specific and severe problems in being able to communicate. This is a tremendous gift that allows us to be able to be aware of all things in all areas that we might be in. And our knowledge of ourselves and what it is that we might be perceiving is very, very important for us to be able to be aware of. Let me talk about some things in here that I think are very basic before we go on for us to understand. Now, when I decided that I needed to write down on paper a lot of the information that I had discovered, I chose something that most of us have been exposed to, minerals and vitamins, to begin to give this information as to how something so simple as a mineral and vitamin might be different in concentration or type based upon the amount of melanin that you have. Well, when I began to look at the biochemistry of melanin, it was very interesting to recognize that many of the vitamins and minerals that are prescribed are part of the melanin molecule already. Vitamin D is part of the melanin molecule. All you have to do is go outside for 20 minutes and stand in the sun, and your body makes vitamin D for you. It's something that you never have to take. So it made sense to me then that those individuals who lived in the north, where there was very little sun, okay, let me just, give you some further information on vitamin D. We need vitamin D to be able to absorb and utilize calcium. So if you lived in the north where there is very little sun and you stayed there long enough, eventually you wound up being very pale and having what appears to be no melanin. So obviously you need calcium for your bone structure, your hair and nails. How are you going to get it? Well, you can't make it from the melanin because you don't have it. So therefore, a big research project took effect to find out what outside of ourselves could be identified to make melanin, since we no longer could make it from within. And it was discovered that cod liver oil was very high in vitamin D. So if we caught these fish and took the fat off of them and stored it and took a little bit every day, then we'd be able to hold on to our calcium and absorb that was in our food. So now when you recognize that, and you realize that now you're standing there in the store next to somebody who's jet black, and they come over and they ask you what type of vitamin D or cod liver oil would be good for them, what do? Because you know that this individual does not need cod liver oil, and as a matter of fact, them taking cod liver oil starts to actually produce crystallization and hardening in their soft tissues. So they start getting all these little lumps and knots and things under the skin and in the muscle because they have too much vitamin D and they're absorbing and holding on to too much calcium that can't be deposited in the bone, so then the body has to take it and deposit it somewhere else, but calcium is not supposed to be there. We found out that riboflavin, for example, and pyridoxine are normal parts of the melanin molecule, where pyridoxine and riboflavin are very important to prevent certain skin diseases and to propel certain reactions to occur in the body. As long as you have melanin, you don't ever need to take these particular vitamins. Now it was very interesting because when I did the research, I noticed that many health books, many health practitioners are talking about niacin. That if you have poor circulation, that you should take niacin because niacin opens up your circulation so that the tissues can get oxygen. But when I did the research on niacin, I found out that niacin is a byproduct of the toxic drug known as nicotine, and that it was not a vitamin at all. It is actually an addictive drug known as nicotine. It's a byproduct of that. But this particular byproduct of nicotine has the capacity to cause the superficial blood vessels to dilate. So I was like, oh, that's real interesting. Well, let's find out more about that. Well, I found out that individuals who have very clumpy melanin, which appears as though they don't have any, okay, what we call melanin recessive individuals, also do not have a complete, well-developed superficial circulation. So it's very interesting because, as I talked about earlier, the fact that the more melanin you have, you also have a nerve ending connected to the melanin granule, which means you have two brains, one outside and one inside your head. Now, for all those melanin granules you have, especially the darker you are, you've got to get oxygen to them. So the body knows that and makes sure that you have a circulatory system that will carry the blood to the melanin granule so that it will stay alive to relay information to the nerve that it's attached to so that it gets back to your brain so you can make a decision about what it is that you found out is going on in your environment. So therefore, the melanin dominant individual has two circulatory systems. A deep circulatory system and a superficial circulatory system, just like they have an internal and external brain. Individuals who are melanin recessive only have a deep circulatory system, and they do not have a well-developed superficial circulatory system. So therefore, because they knew that about themselves, they had to have a means of being able to drive the blood to the skin. So when they found out about niacin that causes the superficial blood vessels to dilate, this was an excellent idea to take this so that the superficial blood vessels could get bigger so that more blood could get to the skin. And to then make it something essential in your diet, that is to make it a vitamin, would mean that you would always ensure, if you taught your children this, that this was something that they would make sure that they would want to have. Now I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. So this isn't even a vitamin, and it's not even something that we're supposed to take. Because now when we look at the effect of what nicotine does to the melanin molecule, it's horrendous. Nicotine actually just about deactivates the melanin molecule. It actually causes a sludging effect, and it actually diminishes its capacity to actually even pick up frequencies of light to relay the information to the brain. So it's very, very interesting because unlike Caucasians that smoke heavily, when we look at the whites of the eye, when we look at the color or luster of the skin of melanin-dominant individuals that take in nicotine, it totally shuts their lights out. That is to say that you can walk up the street and see a black person who smokes because they look like someone has blown sun on their face. They have no luster at all, there's no light, there's no sheen at all on their face. You do not see that in Caucasians who smoke. The way that you can tell they smoke is that you can look at their fingers where they hold the cigarette and see the actual nicotine deposit in the skin or see the discoloration on their teeth. But you can't look in their face and tell whether they're smokers or not, because they don't have the melanin that actually circulates the light through the skin for you to see if it is actually now dysfunctional or not working because of the reaction of the nicotine. So it's not coincidental that the smoker also, who is melanin dominant, especially has problems with loss of sensory perception. That is, that they can get burned easy because now the melanin that would normally feel the heat, because it's not active, they don't feel that anymore. So they get numbness in their hands, tingling in their hands, tingling in their feet. They also begin to lose their sense of taste. And they have to start using much more salt, eating more spicier foods, etc., because the melanin molecule now, the nicotine in the cigarette smoke is now actually diminishing the entire sensitivity of the nervous system. So I'm like, oh, now this is very, very interesting. So when they have this old adage, one man's medicine is another man's poison, very, very true in the case of nicotine and being melanin recessive or melanin dominant. Now, we went on to look at some other interesting things. We went on to find out, for example, that the melanin loves fat. It loves fat. And so anytime there's fat put in the body, it actually bonds to the melanin molecule and is used very slowly. And in many circumstances, it's recycled. So therefore, melanin-dominant individuals do not have to have high-fat diets to maintain their body fat. Because when they eat that, it's actually bound to the melanin molecule and recycled. So therefore, there was a whole story and a study. Some hospitals have been doing studies on African women to find out why it is that they're the most fattest women in the world. Now, obviously, I know the answer. It's because they have a substance in their body that loves fat already. And so therefore, if they eat diets that are extremely high in fat, animal fat especially, hamburgers, meat of any type that is high in fat, because their body will already store fat, and they put extra fat inside their bodies, and they don't release it because the melanin binds it on. That's why they're the fattest women in the world, because they eat inappropriately for their body metabolism, physiology, and structure. Now I said, well, that's real interesting, because now why would we have this gift? I'm always into looking at everything as a gift, not a problem. So when you look at it as a gift, then that automatically then gives you insight as to how you can use it for your advantage, not to reject it. So I'm like, okay, now the Creator gave us this gift. We can eat just a little fat and we'll keep it for 5 years. Now what's the reason for that? Well, then when I went back and looked at, well, where do all these people live primarily that have this propensity to store fat. And they live in an area that is very hot, and that most of the foods there have very little fat. So if you're living at the equator and it's 110 degrees every day, if you know anything about energies, sugar, fat, and protein, when it is broken down by the body, gives off energy. That's why we eat. Out of all the 3 building blocks of the body, the fat molecule gives off the highest concentration of energy. So that is to say that if it was 110 degrees outside, and if you killed an animal and sat down and ate it, you would overheat your body and would have a heat stroke. Not because it was too hot outside, but because you ate a substance that when your body breaks it down, gives out so much heat that from the heat from the outside and the heat that's generated from within, it would totally short-circuit your normal functioning capacity. Now, all you have to do is just try this out today. The last time I heard it was 92 degrees. So now you just go to Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's or someplace and get you a hamburger. And just sit there and eat it. And see what happens to you in a half hour. Just sit right there on the bench and just eat it and see what happens to you in a half hour. You will become so miserable you cannot stand it. And so your natural reaction is going to be that you want something that has ice in it, something that's cold, or you got to get to the air conditioner fast. And this is very interesting because when I was a child, I was very concerned one year. I must have been about 7 years old, and that's all I heard was sirens going up and down the street, and on the news they were cautioning everybody about it being too hot and having heart attacks. Now this was before it was popular for everybody to have air conditioning, and they were even giving out fans to the older people to cool them down. Because with the temperature being so hot this time of this particular summer, so many people were having heart attacks that the hospitals couldn't help them. And I said, what is happening? As a little kid, I said, what is happening that would cause, that would cause so many people to have heart attacks? Well, when I began to do the studying years later, I recognized that again, all these people forgot about the normal physiology, of the food constituents, and they were all sitting there this hot summer eating this meat. But because there were no air conditionings and they didn't have any fans, it was overheating their bodies, and they were actually having heart attacks and angina and were having to go to the hospital. So now I recognize that we can tolerate an enormous amount of heat when we eat properly and eat in alignment with our normal physiological structure. Now let me tell you about heat and the melanin molecule. Carol Barnes writes a lot about this. This is how he got interested in doing the research on melanin. Okay, thank you. He was given an assignment to find out what he could do to insulate the wiring of a high projectile object so that it would not short-circuit electrically while going through space. This was a project that his company he worked for was being contracted by NASA to figure out. If you remember the Sputniks and all these other objects they were projecting in outer space, they all burn up before they could get out of the stratosphere. And the reason why is because the electrical wiring would set the object on fire. Because when it would go through space, the friction would overheat it and it would actually start a fire. So their thing is like, we got to have a means of communicating with this thing. It's got to have electrical wiring, but how can we get it through the stratosphere to outer space and it not burn up? So again, because they've been doing research on melanin since the 1700s, they knew that melanin had a wonderful capacity, that it could be exposed to high temperatures and actually drop the temperature by 50 to 60%, even though it was exposed to high temperatures, and maintain its normal metabolic functioning. So they have found out that the melanin molecule can be exposed to up to 1,500 degrees of temperature and only lose 50% of its normal functioning. And that it also can drop the temperature after exposure by 50%. So therefore, Carol Barnes and his company made synthetic melanin incorporated it into the rubber that enclosed these electrical wires, and that's how these objects are now being able to get out of space, because they are all insulated and lined with artificial melanin that covers the wiring system. So then that really says something about you then, because now here you are, it's only 92 degrees outside, and you have a substance within you that has the capacity to absorb heat and dissipate it so that you don't even get hot. Why would you be fanning, and why would being in 90-degree weather be a problem for you? Normally it wouldn't if the melanin was functioning properly, or if you hadn't put something in your body that caused the melanin to get overheat. So what we see is many people who are African people who talk about they can't stand the sunshine, they can't stand the heat. They've come in contact with a substance that has bound itself to the melanin molecule, where the melanin molecule is not functioning normally anymore. So the key here is not an inability to be able to deal with sunlight and to deal with high temperatures, but we're looking at a toxic reaction. So therefore that means that with the air circulating in here, our body will normally give off this heat through perspiration. We can be active, etc., and still be comfortable. Air conditioning is not something that is a natural need for us. And it's very interesting because when we expose ourselves to this, the first thing that we notice is an incapacity to move. And when I say that is that the first thing that people want to do is that they want to sit down. They don't want to do anything. And then they find out they can't get up after they sat down in that for so long. So it brings about rigidity, stiffness, the loss of mobility, etc., which is a dis-ease state. It brings about a dis-ease state. And when you think about it, it does the exact same thing that it would do to water. Water, when it's in its normal state, is fluid. It'll go in any direction that it is exposed to unless you contain it, which is how your body's supposed to be. As soon as you drop the temperature, what happens? It gets stiff, rigid, and fixed. And that's the same effect that any cold environment has on us. We're not supposed to be stiff, rigid, and fixed, nor are we to expose ourselves to cold environments, because we do not have a circulatory system that supports our metabolism to do this, because remember what I said, we have to have blood in two places at the same time. We have to have blood under the skin because of all this melanin to feed the second brain, and blood deep within to supply the deep organs. Now, unlike the African, if you put the Caucasian in ice, they do fine. That's why they were able to ski and play hockey and all the other stuff that they do, because now all their blood is deep in the body. So therefore, even though it might be cold on the outside, they don't feel that very much because they don't have a blood supply that is taking a lot of information to the skin anyway. But the major areas of the body, their flexible joints, their liver, etc., is staying warm because all the blood is pooled there in their only circulatory system. So when I began to look at environment and its effect on the structures of bodies, and then why bodies were structured the way they were based on the functions they were to serve, then it got very clear to me as a physician that there were some serious problems in the healthcare system in relationship to honoring the uniqueness of an individual's body and what it was supposed to do. Now, how many of your physicians are telling you this? And how many of your physicians are able to basically tell you why there's certain food you should have, why certain vitamins you can't take, and most of all, why certain drugs are very dangerous for you because of these unique structures that you have? Now, you can go to your plant store or your botanical store, and they'll be able to give you this information for any particular plant. Chrysanthemums, roses, petunias, etc. They can tell you what to give them, what not, the food, etc. that they should have. You can go to your pet shop, and they can tell you why French poodles have to have a certain type of food with certain type of protein in them and a certain type of fat concentration, whereas a German Shepherd has to have something totally different. But why not for humans? Now, I thought that was incredible, that we have ecology for pets, ecology for animals, and there's no ecologic system created right now that's practiced to make sure that each unique type of human being maintains and stays the best that it can be. So now, what do you do then if you are paying into and visiting a system that has not seen you or thought of a need to give you the best information for you so that you can be the best? Well, you have a lot of choices. The simplest, obvious two is that you can then demand that the system give you that, or you can do the study on your own and give it to yourself. And so that's why I felt that it was extremely important to put this information down so that you could have it to make some decisions about how you wanted to continue to treat yourselves. Because what is being offered to us and available at this point in time is not honoring the unique attributes and principles that we have, which is why they just tell you right up front, you all don't seem to do well when you come here to get our medicine, etc. Okay, but now they never told you why that you didn't do well. But now you can have the answer. There's a tremendous amount of information to let you know why. I want to bring it to your attention about just a few more things. It was real interesting when we started looking at drugs, because I was very concerned about that. If I prescribe for you a phenothiazine drug, which is Haldol, Elavil, Prolixin, Thorazine, all of these different type drugs, because of supposing you're having some problems being able to stay in the orientation of this space and time and this reality. Or if I prescribe for you a hypertensive drug, was I really giving you the proper concentration based upon your unique chemistry? And when I began to do the research on that, just these two particular families of drugs, I found out that I was doing you a disservice, because it has been identified that giving Africans and melanin-dominant individuals Haldol, Prolixin, Thorazine, etc., the dosage has to be significantly low. Because of the amount of neurologic tissue that we have, this drug has a tendency to cause extreme impairment of the nervous system very rapidly. And that it had already been identified that the Caucasians needed a much higher concentration of these drugs to have the effect than the African. Now, for those patients that have come to see me that for whatever reason were diagnosed to have been schizophrenic or had an acute or mild depression, they were on the highest doses of this stuff. And when you looked in the PDR, it was actually the same dose that was recommended that was based for the Caucasian. Thank you. So I was quite concerned about the fact that many of the individuals that I was seeing that were taking this were having problems with memory loss. They were having problems with bladder control. They were having problems with severe paranoia, even far beyond when they got on the medication. And I would ask them to ask their doctors, did they know anything about why they should have these kind of reactions? And every time, the patient would come back and say the doctor doesn't want to cut the dose down. As a matter of fact, too many times it was increased. So I'm like, oh, this is very, very interesting. It was also noted that the antihypertensive drugs, because of the structure of our bodies, that when they gave us enough to decrease our blood pressure, everything else decreased. Our desire for sex, desire to eat, desire to think, desire to move, and everything else. I'm like, oh, this is like really interesting. So the key here is, what are we going to do? Because now it's very clear that there is a whole hospital system that we have been asked to become clients of that do not have the information to be able to treat us appropriately based on our basic chemistry and sensitivity. Are you going to ask the doctor to go back to medical school to find out what is needed for you? And most of them, I don't think, would take that too well. So the key here is that there needs to then be an understanding that there are certain things that you can do for yourself to help you until the system catches up with understanding who they are treating. I was very surprised to find out that because of our structure, we mature almost 50% faster than the Caucasian race. That is to say that they have identified the fact that the African is an adult by age 14. That the African can actually begin to be toilet trained by 6 months of age. And so therefore, when the African child is held at home and not allowed to go to school until he or she is 5 years old, retardation has already ensued. When the African child is not asked to begin to become aware of their own neurologic function and memory function at 6 months old, and they're asked to wait till 2 years old, retardation has already ensued. So now, then what are we to do? Because now we have to become aware of the fact that we are living in a system that is not serving us for us to be our best. We can ask the question if that is the system's responsibility or is it ours to give ourselves the best. In closing, it seems like time goes so fast, I just want to relate to you just a couple more things. That in this melanin research, it was noted that many of the opiate drugs, and actually they refer to parts of the melanin as the opiomelanotropic molecule, that opium, heroin, tetrahydrocannabinol, which comes from marijuana, crack, all have parent structures exactly like a large part of the melanin molecule. Now, I thought that was very interesting, that the basic core structure of these street drugs have the basic core structure of the melanin molecule. So it has always been noted that when a melanin recessive individual and a melanin dominant individual were detoxing from the use of these drugs, the melanin dominant individual had a tremendously much more difficult time in doing so. Well, now we know the reason. Because when this substance is put into the body, it is not just put into the body and excreted through the urine and through the lungs and liver. It actually binds to your melanin. And depending upon what you're eating or what you're not eating, can bind to it for life. Fine. That means then that our detox programs have to have some different features in them for melanin dominant individuals to be able to detoxify from these substances. When you ask what is the program that our detoxification or drug rehab programs have to break these substances off the melanin molecule, what is their response to you? They look at you like you're crazy. They don't know what you're talking about. It has been identified that we secrete melanin on a 24-hour basis, and that based upon our activity, what we've eaten, the concentration can go up or down, and also based upon our health. If you happen to get a urine sample tested for particular drugs that I've named, because the melanin molecule and that drug have the same parent structure, you probably will test positive. Isn't that interesting? So we wonder how many people have been incarcerated because they've been accused of breaking their probation or fired from their job because they've been accused of using drugs when they were only excreting a normal byproduct of their body. And last but not least, in all this extensive research, it has been identified that the AIDS virus will not grow in the presence of melanin. And that as they have taken these culture plates and streaked them with melanin, the AIDS virus cannot be cultured on those plates. AIDS and melanin do not go together. And as a matter of fact, in these books that I have back here, that's one of the new research drugs that they're going to use to cure AIDS, is a form of melanin. So now what does that say about supposedly the African people that have melanin? Do they have it or don't they have it? Or has something happened to their melanin molecule that no longer stimulates their immune system? Because there's a direct relationship between the health of your melanin and your immune system. Those races that have little melanin or do not have what we call pheomelanin, eumelanin, have immune system disease problems much more frequently. So now this goes into what I call a sociopathic reaction about melanin, because we have found that individuals who have issues with melanin, because they are not able to utilize the molecule openly and receptively, their thoughts create chemicals from the brain that actually deactivate the molecule. Now that was really profound, So I'll say that again. I want you to clearly understand that those individuals who have issues about having melanin, that is, that in our cultural society as Africans, there are cliches, there are statements about being too black, about having too nappy hair, about having a nose that's too wide, etc. When those type statements are made, the brain will secrete a substance that will begin to attack the aspect of yourself that you are having issues with, and will render that aspect, if this is done on a long-term basis, inactive, or bring about its destruction. So as far as I'm concerned, that's what then let me know why Africans have AIDS, because it should be impossible otherwise. But there's an issue at all that any aspect of your body is a deficit for you, or that it basically does not serve you well, that it can't function for you by your own thoughts. So I bring this information to you because I want you to begin to recognize that this substance that you have in your body that's not just responsible for hair color, for eye color, etc., is an intricate part of your being that has particular attributes, talents, receptivity, that based upon your perception of what you know about it and how you use it can allow you to have total access to anything in the universe, or totally be responsible for you creating your own demise. Because obviously if you have this and it's necessary for immune function, it's necessary for you to have a functional circulatory system so that you can heal at the rate that you are traumatized by the environment, which gives you the gift of not having to age, etc. And this is rejected, then all the things that are really not even your destiny, you must have, not for any other reason other than because of how you think. Thank you. Are there any questions? If there are questions, yeah, you want to come up to the front. I think we only have one microphone, but we'd like to get that on the mic. You want to line up if you have questions? Yeah. Please. Yeah, we're recording this, so we'd like the questions on tape for further educational purposes. This is on video, so you have to look that way.
I have two questions. The first question is, I'm a computer programmer, and I'm in front of a computer all day. Is there anything I can do to protect myself? You were talking about being exposed to radiation on a daily basis. I work on a computer every day, and how it affects the birth of your child.
Yes. Unfortunately, I've seen children born with cerebral palsy and some other non-specific neurologic defects of women who worked around microwave and computers. So what I recommend is that you insist that there be a LED screen put on the front of the computer, and that also the computer be tested every quarter for the amount of radiation that is given off. Okay. Thirdly, there are substances that you can take that are very high in superoxide dismutase, SOD, which actually removes free radicals from the bloodstream. Okay. What happens is that when you are exposed to something that creates a toxic reaction, it creates a substance known as a free radical, and it's the responsibility for the liver to neutralize it. If these free radicals are in excess, then your body needs help. And so there's a substance by the name of suncorella A granules. It's a little plant that lives in the sea. This is the same thing that whales eat, that you can take on a daily basis that will get that out of your body. Yeah, suncorella. And as a matter of fact, suncorella is so awesome, some people might say, well, that's all she recommends is suncorella. Well, why is it that that's all I recommend as opposed to a lot of hodgepodges that are made up of herbs? Suncorella was the plant that was used by the Japanese to heal themselves of radiation sickness and radiation burns after the bombs were dropped upon them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you have to understand that within 40 years' time, if you can find a food that totally regenerates your genetic structure and totally heals your tissues from all the free radicals and everything else, so that you can actually then now come over to another country and take over its economic system in a matter of 40 years, then you need to be taking that on a daily basis. So that's why I recommend it. So they went to the sea, they understood the minerals, and they understood the chlorophyll molecule. The chlorophyll molecule is the first cousin to melanin. They look exactly the same almost, except they have a different core element in the center. So that's very important. That's why dark green leafy vegetables are to a melanin dominant individual. And I don't mean greens cooked for hours with meat, because that is trash and you might as well throw that out. So green vegetables that are lightly steamed or eaten raw is what I'm talking about, because they still have to be green for them to have the effect on cleaning the melanin. They can't be dark brown or olive green, because you've destroyed that. Okay? Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Fine.
Good. I have asthma, and they just recently put me on a medication called Asthmaport, and there are times that I do take the medicine that it does not help. So what can I do health-wise that I won't have to take the Asthmaport or the Primatene Mist to clear my asthma up?
Okay. Asthma is interesting, and as above, so below. You know we have 5 bodies. Most of us have 4, hoping to build an extra one known as the 5th body. So we have a soul body, we have a mental body, an emotional body, and a physical body. The spiritual body is something that each and every one of us is asked to create for ourselves this lifetime. And so how creation works in this dimension is that anything on the physical level originates from the invisible. And so that is to say that every disease has a mental, spiritual, or should I say a mental and emotional origin, as well as a physical origin. From the physical level, I have found that many people have inflicted asthma or lung problems on themselves that are melanin dominant because they eat dairy products. We cannot eat dairy products after the age of 5 years old. And the only dairy products that Africans can metabolize properly has to come from a human. Not from a cow, not from a goat, not from any other animal except a human. So if you do not have access to yogurt made from human milk, milk made from human milk, cheese made from human milk, then as a melanin-dominant individual, that is not what you're supposed to eat. It has taken millions of years for the Caucasians to inculcate in their genetic memory the capacity to use a lower animal's excrements. You have to understand that milk is an excrement. Butter is an excrement from an animal. And to be able to metabolize that and work it down has taken millions of years of them eating that to be able to utilize it properly. So therefore, they had no choice because of the amount of protein and fat that they needed to stay warm in a cold climate to use the excrement of lower animals to sustain themselves. And so therefore, after eating that for millions of years, they are able to break it down. We cannot break that down after the age of 5 years old. And so giving our children milk and dairy products, giving ourselves that, it actually clogs up the intestines. When the intestines get clogged up, then it actually then builds up into the lungs. So as above, so below. So you want to have healthy lungs, you've got to have a healthy digestive tract. Constipation is one of the main reasons why so many people have lung disease. Secondly, also eating mucousy foods and not getting the mucus off the walls of your colon. Thirdly, inappropriate exercise. That is, what do you do to really stress your lungs? If you want to maintain something, you have to use it. Most people, when they start having problems with a part of their body, the first thing they do is want to cut it off and not use it. If you do not use it, you will lose it. So that means that if you want to get over this impairment in your lungs, then you must walk. You must exercise. And you don't do it until you fall out, but you do it until it becomes uncomfortable for you. And then you do it the next day. And you do it the next day. And what will happen is that you will find that it no longer becomes uncomfortable, and then you can do more. And then more will become uncomfortable. And then you keep doing that until it no longer becomes uncomfortable. And then pretty soon you'll find that regular exercise no longer is a problem. You understand what I'm saying? Many of us have parasites. that because of eating animal flesh, that we have worms in our colon, and they can stay there for up to 35 years. And so when those worms lay their eggs twice a month at the new moon and the full moon, you will go into an asthma attack. And so therefore, you have to then make sure that you do not have worms, and you have to take a dewormer. So many times I've seen patients in full-blown asthma only because it's at the new moon when the eggs are circulating in their bloodstream. So therefore, they go to the doctor and get full of cortisone shots and epinephrine and a whole bunch of other stuff when they need to be dewormed. So when you deworm them and they load the toilet up full of the worms, they don't have asthma anymore.
Thank you so very much.
All right.
I work in a drug and alcohol field, and I'd like to know what could be done to detoxify melanin and revitalize it.
Okay. One of the most important substances for melanin is light. And so I think it's very important for any of these institutions to check what kind of lighting they're exposing the clients to. Okay, if you do not have incandescent bulbs, then you should buy what's called the chroma lights, which are actually full spectrum lights. That's very, very important. To have them under fluorescent lights is very, very dangerous. They've actually proven that melanin-dominant individuals that are exposed to certain frequencies of fluorescent light will actually begin to exhibit bizarre hyperactive behavior. And so in our schools, much of the lighting is inadequate, and for the children especially, it causes them to be hyperactive. The child is not a slow learner or has an attention deficit. It just needs to get that light bulb off of his skin. Do you understand what I'm saying? Secondly, sugar, white sugar that does not have the B vitamins on it, and again, eating processed foods that have a lot of chemicals on it, MSG, BTH, canned foods, etc., are no-no for an individual that's trying to break toxins off the melanin molecule. And thirdly, there are herbal formulas that can be administered to also help break that off. But right now, most Africans who have been addicted to drugs are really drug-free only by their sheer will, because they still are heavily laden with drugs in their body. I don't care if they haven't used for 5 or 6 years. That drug is like a part of them, and it's just a conscious effort for them every day to just fight that feeling. And that is not what I call a rehab program.
What about the herbal formulas?
Well, now there's only 2 herbal formulas that I know of. There's the Pro-Melanin 2000, and then there's the Sun Life Foods. The Pro-Melanin 2000, I think, can be obtained, but I don't have the resource right now. The Sun Life Foods will be available in September, and so we're looking forward to that.
What's in them?
It's a long litany of herbs. Okay, but the main thing is that the herbs themselves contain pre-melanin, or should I say contain precursors for melanin. Okay, and that's the main thing. So it's a huge molecule, so you have to like study it and kind of put it together. Okay, thank you. That's it.
Hotel, everyone. Dr. Jewel.
Yes.
Glad to see you again.
Thank you.
I was having this discussion yesterday, and the question came up. Actually, I posed a question. I know you prescribe macrobiotic diet, and the question that came around in my mind was, well, what about the Ayurvedic diet? Meaning that Indians or people from India tend to be closer to us genetically than Japanese. So I wanted to answer that question. What do you think? And if you don't prescribe Ayurvedic diet, then why not?
Okay, thank you. The macrobiotic diet is a diet that varies based on where you live on the planet. Macro meaning large and biotic meaning study of life. So I do not prescribe a macrobiotic diet based on the Japanese. I prescribe a macrobiotic diet based upon where your location is in time and space. Me living in Detroit, Michigan versus somebody living in Florida, there are different foods that are available to us, and the foods have different information in them. And so for you to be able to master that time and space requires that you take information in your body through the food from that particular area. Okay? So if you're in Africa, the macrobiotic diet is going to be different. If you're in Alaska, the macrobiotic diet is going to be different. I don't find, unless there are Africans or Africans here in America that come from ancestry that has lived in areas where, for example, rice was a main staple, that we really digest that very well. And I think that's one reason why so many Africans here in America like white rice, because anybody can digest that. It's adulterated, it's just pure gluten, okay? But when you give them brown rice, many of them will find that it gives them gas, as opposed to eating other grains that are more in alignment with what's in Africa. You know, corn, millet, sorghum, okay? But that's not something that grows here all of the time. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's why I prescribe the macrobiotic diet, because it allows an individual to have mastery over the environment that they live in most of the time, because they're eating local foods. Ayurveda, as you know, comes from Eastern India, and the plants that they use are spices. Okay, spices don't grow here. And so therefore, if there's a medicinal reason to treat, if there's a medicinal problem, you'd have to then ask them to go and buy something that will be imported, that has information about a time and space that they don't even exist in. And so therefore, I don't use Ayurvedic remedies and Ayurvedic foods, because they don't even grow where we live. So if I were in India, then that's the system that I would use. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Fine, how are you?
You mentioned that we should not be eating dietary products, that we need low-fat diets. Could you speak more on the types of diets, what we should have in our diet, which is good for us and what is not bad for us? And could you also speak on herbs, how that relates to us and what we should or should not be taking?
The African body is not created to digest high concentrations of fat and protein, okay? In most food sources, the only way you get concentrated fat and protein is when you eat animal flesh. And so the African is not designed to eat flesh. And if in the species of African, there is a individual that would eat flesh, it would be the male, not the female. Okay, one of the greatest travesties on a social level that has happened to Africans in America is the eating of flesh by the African woman. And when the African woman is willing to stop eating flesh, she will actually begin to have a victory in her own home, in her own community, and most of all, a reunion with her man. And the reason why is because the concentrated protein and fat creates what we call an androgenic reaction in the woman. It actually produces an increase of testosterone. So therefore, her whole magnetism changes to one of electric. So it becomes the same as the man. Okay, so therefore, many men will tell you that in the presence of an African woman, it's like being with another man. So they don't have any problems busting us upside the head with their fists and the whole bit, because we don't have any problems jumping up in their chest like we are like them. And it's a whole identity confusion that comes about because of a biological, chemical abnormality because of improper diet. Okay? So she is not created to tolerate high concentrations of animal fat and protein because it produces an androgenic reaction. See, the highest level of testosterone in the human race is in the African man. And then the second highest level of testosterone in the human race is in the African woman. Do you understand that? Is that I have more testosterone than most white men, Asian men, Indian men. Okay, and I don't have to do very much at all to bust out with sideburns and a beard and a mustache, etc. through my diet, which is why there's so many African women that have that. Okay, do you understand what I'm saying? So I'm saying my muscle mass automatically is 8 times more than a Caucasian, 10 times more bone mass, etc. As a woman, do you understand what I'm saying? So this is why I'm saying that therefore it's very crucial that the African woman has to refrain from eating those foods in high concentration. Okay? Now, because of what protein does, protein is an ego builder. Okay, on a metaphysical level, protein builds ego. And so if anybody is to have the ego, it should be the man, because he's the one that has to go out into the world and choreograph the life force energy that he receives from us, right? So that means he has to have some tenacity, he has to have some arrogance, he has to have some courage to go out there and do what he has to do, because he can't come back with an empty hand to me if he's taking my life force energy, okay? So that's why he has to eat more protein. Now, when a woman eats more protein, it actually makes her ovaries hard and rubbery. And that is where the life force energy emanates, from the pelvis. So when her pelvis becomes full of tumors and her ovaries become rubbery, her life force energy diminishes. And you see that everywhere she goes, because there's nothing that is imbuing life. Everything is raggedy, old, peeling, kicked to the side, full of trash and garbage. And you know that if there's women that are living there, they have a sick pelvis. I guarantee you. A woman whose ovaries are kicking and her uterus is nice and soft like it's supposed to be, I don't care how little her stuff is, it's gorgeous. Because she can't help but do that, because she is actually a walking vessel that contains life force energy. I don't care whether she's a doctor who is a vessel of life force, or a secretary who's a vessel of life force, or a homemaker who's a vessel of life force. Wherever she is, it's supposed to be imminent and full of life force energy. So when there are females in environments and there's nothing living and everything is ruined and not fixed up, it's because she has a reproductive imbalance that is causing her, or a psychological state that is causing her to shut down and not release that energy. That's why it's so crucial for us. Okay, now, obviously, what are we supposed to be eating? Well, for women, they definitely need foods that keep them open and expansive. So leaves that are open and expansive. Flowers, okay, which are in the forms of fruits. But only fruits in season, and only fruits where you live. Do you understand what I'm saying? So therefore, you don't sit up in the wintertime and eat watermelon and cantaloupe. Okay? And these things only come in season in late July and October. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I'm saying that therefore, dark green leafy vegetables, grains in season, okay, and those kind of foods are very much complementary to the African woman. And when she eats those, all kind of wonderful things happen. Okay, next.
You mentioned something about cells, and I had a question about sickle cell, and problem with sickle cell, and in general.
Okay, thank you. Y'all don't say too much about sickle cell, because I'm just healing over that, really, a personal healing. Because when I began to look at the campaign that was put forth in the late 60s, the little monies that were put together to have these little buses go in our community to draw our blood out, it was actually for genetic research. It was not to actually elucidate any type cure for sickle cell, because it was understood that it was not a disease. It is actually an environmental adaptation. And so in those areas in Africa where it was very moist and swampy, where mosquitoes reigned, that the red blood cell took on a different shape so that it could actually exist with this particular bacteria in the bloodstream and not allow the individual to die. Okay? Now, sickle cell is not a problem anywhere in the world if the individual eats a diet that is respectful of their body. One of the worst things that Africans with sickle cell trait or sickle cell disease can do is begin to eat sugar. When you give sickle cell trait, sickle cell individual sugar, I mean, somebody was even telling me that they give them Gatorade. I was astounded in the hospital, because this person is going to crisis, 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 crisis on to the grave. You can never have sickle cell, because the first thing it does, it attacks the spleen. And if you have sickle cell, you've got to keep your spleen healthy so that it can continuously take those distorted blood cells out of the circulation so that you can function. If you eat sugar, the spleen becomes non-functional. All these abnormal cells then now get stuck in the joints, and that's when you start having pain and stiffness. And the bilirubin, which is a breakdown product of the blood, now backs up into the blood, overloads the liver. You get jaundice and the whole ugly scenario. So the key is that sugar is a no-no for these individuals. They cannot have Hostess Twinkies. They cannot have cupcakes. They cannot have juice. They cannot have pop. They cannot have white bread. They cannot eat any of that. And if they were in Africa, none of that would exist, right? So that's why everybody's walking around with sickle cell and nobody knew they had it. Because they did not eat a diet that challenged the blood to challenge the spleen so that it became a problem. So this is one of the worst things that parents can do that have children with sickle cell, is to give them juice, pop, dairy products, sugar, and white flour foods. And if you stay away from that, I guarantee you, you won't know that you have sickle cell or sickle cell trait. Okay? Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much. If you're interested, we have a few tapes out in the back, not only on melanin in addition, and in our book, Vitamins and Minerals from A to Z, but I think there's some other things out there. I'll be more than glad to sign your tapes or your books for you. So I'll meet you at the back table. Oh, yes. One more thing, please, before you leave. Hello, don't leave. This is important. If you've heard me say this before, as above, so below. Everything that's outside of you is also inside of you. Now I will say this again. As above, so below, and everything that is outside of you is also inside of you. What is happening here is that there's so much information, so much misinformation, that many people are now very confused about what should they do. They don't know how to eat. They don't know what vitamins to take. They don't know what they should do. They don't know if they have a purpose or not. They don't know if somebody's telling them the truth. They don't know if the TV's lying. They don't know if the book is right. I mean, this is Judgment Day. There's so much information out there. How are you going to know what's correct? Well, again, everybody is created completely capable of mastering any experience that they create for themselves, because we are all manifestations of the Creator. So any question that you have, or the need to authenticate any particular information, can come from within. Now, if there's people outside of you, there are people inside of you. If there are people outside of you, there are people inside of you. The individuals that come here inside of you are here to give you the real deal about you. And they are called guides, G-U-I-D-E-S. The commitment is that if they're able to give you the information on what's really happening, it also helps them to evolve in their own inner plane growth and development, just like you get the deal to evolve out here. Now, the agreement is, however, is that nothing can be forced upon you, because you are a developing god or goddess. So they can't get busy in there talking to you without your permission. So that means that they have to sit there and see you eat things that you don't have no business, do things you don't have no business, get involved in stuff you don't have any business, and they have to go along with the consequences. That's the agreement, unless you start asking yourself for help. Now, when you start asking yourself for help, then that's when you give them permission to start downloading a whole bunch of information about you that you probably forgot about or you didn't know. Now, there are direct techniques to teach you how to access these internal resources, and it's known as an inner guide meditation. These have been done for thousands and thousands of years, and normally under, quote, spiritual conditions, because this is part of what you need to be able to build a spiritual body. Now, my definition of a spiritual body is the capacity for you to be able to think, to do, and to feel the same way. I'll say that again. For you to be a spiritual person, you must be able to feel and think and do what you feel and think. If you cannot do what you feel and think, you are not a spiritual person, and you cannot build a spiritual body. I don't care how many times you read the Bible. It has nothing to do with that. Has nothing to do with how many times you go to church. It's can you do what you truly think and feel? And most people cannot. And so therefore, you got to get some help to know how to be okay and do what you think and feel. And the intelligence that's on the inside of you can give you the inroads on how to be able to do that so that you can build this thing known as a spiritual body. What is a spiritual body? A spiritual body is a funnel. It is actually a collection of energy that allows you to siphon off directly the energy from your soul into your mental, emotional, and physical body. That's what it is. Most people cannot draw off the soul quality energy because they don't have a connection from the soul quality to the mental, the emotional, and physical. The building of a spiritual body allows you to do that. So therefore, the people who have that spiritual body are the ones that when they snap their fingers, whatever they think and want appears. That they can walk around here and do all kinds of things because they are now God on this planet in consciousness. And there's no book that can teach you how to do that because you got to live it to get the energy. And that's what it seems like most of these books are forgetting to tell you. Because you can't sit somewhere and read all this stuff and know the Bible and then not speak to the person next to you. Or get on the telephone and get to gossiping. Or get here and eat these animals that you know are filthy. You are not spiritual when you do that. I don't care how many books you know. And how many times you sit up in the pew on Sunday or Saturday or wherever you go. So the key is for you to be able to break this inconsistency, you got to get in communication with the people that are on the inside. And there's a meditation to do that. On Sunday at 2 o'clock. On Sunday, I think, at 2 o'clock, at our Women's Support Group headquarters, I am going to lead our women who are in the support group in an inner guide meditation for them to begin to have access and communication with these individuals who've been sitting there for I don't know how many years, asking and hoping that you would ask them a question. Okay? So if you're interested in that, you know, please feel free to come. You cannot consume alcohol 24 hours before the process. You cannot eat meat. If you are constipated, please take a laxative before you come and wear comfortable clothes. And the reason why, the more comfortable you are able to be without anything tugging at your body, you can then go to the levels where they are and communicate. Okay, make sure you take care of your business so that you can give yourself time to do this. I don't know how long it will take. It's Saturday. You know, we have it scheduled for 2 hours. The meditation might go for 3 hours. So cook your dinner before you go so you don't have to worry about, oh, I got to get back. And make sure that if you have children that you leave them with somebody reliable so that you don't have to worry about are they okay. Because see, you have to understand that you cannot do the inner work when you do not feel supported in the outer world. You cannot do that. So you have to set yourself up that you don't have any distractions from the outer world so that you can go and do the inner work. And that's why most people never build a spiritual body because they're too busy ripping and running up and down the street. And they can't take time to sit down and just be quiet for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Whoa!